I'm getting a lot of questions about home education right now, partly because my wife and I homeschooled our 7 children, but also partly because so many parents have discovered during the pandemic that they prefer a family model of education to the compulsory forced government model. The Gallup poll just out reports that close to 90% of children discovered that they really enjoy being out of the school environment and home with their families, their brothers and sisters, and their parents. The Reason Foundation reports, quote, "We have a lot of examples of families saying that they're going to switch from the government-run school system to the homeschooling system after the pandemic, after things are quieted down." Now, the Federalist has more reports on this. Quote, "As American children were sent home, parents filled the internet complaining about their online assignments as unproductive make work and sometimes propaganda assignments," they found. So home education in any age, here's what I've learned. At any time, at any age, at any time, during any challenge, is really the best arrangement for academic as well as economic and spiritual instruction. It's also the best arrangement for building the emotional and social maturity of your children. I've been watching the homeschooling, the so-called homeschooling movement, since the 1970s. And that's what I've learned. Now here's one more truth that I've learned. Your family's greatest asset will never be money and never be security. It's the maturity of your children, which will be seen in the character of your children. This will affect your family more than any other factor as you go into the future. And any family can develop maturity and character in the children by focusing on these things at home, developing these things at home and watching them develop at home. And it does not require a big budget, and it doesn't even require that parents who are literate. I've known several public school trained graduates who became parents who were totally illiterate because of what they had to endure in the school system. They didn't learn to read, they didn't learn to write, but they began home educating their children because why? They didn't want their children to go in through the same things that they did and come out just as uneducated. So as they began to homeschool their children, they learned right alongside them to read and write and study and research and enjoy learning, and really enjoy learning. How many government school kids actually really love learning? Well, not a whole lot, because of the way that we're fed knowledge, and we're fed knowledge that doesn't really mean anything. Now let me show you 5 important lessons about home education which we have learned, my wife and I have learned over the years, which we have passed on to our children who are home educating their own children now today. They're grown and that's what they're doing today. So first of all, first lesson, do not homeschool, instead home educate. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by this in an example shortly, but the gist of it is you don't set things up like the schools you may have attended with what you remember about school, with desks and curriculum and grading papers and textbooks and workbooks and grades. That's not education, that's schooling, and you don't want to be doing the schooling, you want to rather be doing the education model. That model that you remember, when did that really educate anyone? It really didn't. It wasn't meant to. You know, as we have quoted John Taylor Gatto in the past, New York State Teacher of the Year, New York City Teacher of the Year, he has pointed out that it was not designed to educate. The school system that he taught in for over 20 years was not designed to do that. That's why he quit and got out, began researching the history of education, and told us what he learned from that. Number 2, don't focus more on academics than you do on personal character. Now that is a really important one, because when you start this, you're thinking, okay, I've got to give my children this academic foundation and background and for the future. And yes, you do need to do that, but don't focus more on that than you do on the character of your children, the development of your children's character and teaching them character. Number 3, Because education is about life, then and life in the real world, then you need to be doing life together. That's the main thing that needs to happen during the day when you're together. Do everything together, especially work. Morning, noon, and night. Try to be doing life together. And that's what home education really is. You're teaching them about life and interpreting life to them. The challenges, the hardships, the rewards, getting along with their brothers and sisters is part of education, part of that character education that they need to have. And then in working with them, it is in work that we learn about the character that we have or we don't have for the road ahead. And that's why it's really so important. Number 4 is to read with them and read to them. And then read with them some more, and then read to them some more, and then simply talk about what they're reading. Discuss it with them. And of course, you can start reading to your children at the very, very, very beginning. At age 1 and 2 and 3, be reading to them so that they learn to love books. They know what books are. They know how books work. They have pages that turn. There are pictures in there. There are words in them. It teaches them things. Help them learn to love then conversations about the books that they're reading. And you do this even with your very young children by stopping the reading and talking to them about what they're reading. Almost on every single page you do this. You're beginning to set the foundation for their education at home by simply doing this with them, reading the books. And number 5, which is really important, and I'll try to get into this in other videos, you need to tell them the truth about God and not dodge it. Don't be terrified of the subject. Don't be terrified of the government if you say something true. If you leave out the very essence of truth, which is God himself and the scriptures that he has given to man, then your children, they have completely missed being educated. If they don't have that, they will not have the context to understand anything else that they learn. So what you need to know about these 5 discoveries is that there is a huge difference between schooling as we've known it, we Americans have known it, and education. Schooling is something that slave masters historically do to slaves, and we have centuries and centuries and centuries of seeing this and knowing this. Slave masters don't educate their slaves, they school them. Okay, they school them in behavioral compliance, and they give them a few basic skills useful to the slave society, but no more. Just a little bit about what they need to be able to function. That's schooling. And so what you want to do, you want to equip your children to be instead sound thinkers and leaders of a free society, not a slave society. And you want them to be not the servants at the very bottom rung of the ladder in this society, but rather the thinkers and the leaders who can lead the way into the future. So please don't get hung up on a school-like program or a curriculum. Avoid that. So how did America get off track of education? Because for 2.5, 3 centuries, we really did have a strong culture of education, and it was 99% home education for those 3 centuries. Well, we got off of that, and we got locked into compulsory schooling that was run by the government, that developed a curriculum, a kind of a universal curriculum for everybody across the whole country. That was not true up until very recently, and then we got into it. There was a reason that we fell into that. And in a later video, I'll explain more. I'll give you more of that history. But for now, what you want to know is how do you educate your children privately at home? Really doing this. Many of your children are asking you to do this. Yes, it is legal. It's completely, totally legal in all 50 states now. Will it become, here's another question I get, will it become illegal? No, it won't be. There will be so many people. Now, they will probably try to make it illegal, but they won't be able to. The most effective thing that they may do is just put lots of different strings and attach strings to it and say, okay, we're going to allow people to educate their children at home. And in fact, we'll even give you a free computer if you'll just make your children sit down and go through this curriculum, which includes all the state propaganda that we want you to learn about what's politically correct. So they may try to do that, but you can maintain your freedom completely at home. And so the best arrangement of all, in understanding how you do this, the best example that we've ever had in history can be traced back. If we look at the very best examples of history and we go back in time, the ancient Hebrews really had a very effective way of teaching and a very effective way of learning. The more modern versions of schooling, as we come up through history, were established in Britain after the Norman invasion, and then there were some really clever refinements created in Prussia in the 1700s to give children a more regimented mindset suitable for strict military service and service to the state. That's kind of where some of these ideas came from that we have followed. We followed in the late 1800s and early 1900s as we built in our country a really constraining, forced government school system. So now looking at Britain, we can learn an awful lot about that. There were different kinds of education, and there still are different kinds of education. The future leaders and thinkers, the ones who would go into parliament, the ones who would be the diplomats of the country, the ones who would serve the king and the queen, the ones who would actually become king and queen, they were given real education. And Britain knew the difference between education and schooling. The lower class shopkeepers and functionaries and the laborers and the soldiers, they had a highly regimented schooling and totally different, complete different buildings, complete different systems, complete different schools. And so did the thinkers and leaders even go to school? Because the case I'm making to you right now is that there's such a big difference. If you want to be a leader and a thinker, you don't do schooling, you do education. So did these thinkers in Britain, who did become, many of them, some of the greatest and best educated people in all of history, and in the ways that they were able to be men of letters, men of poetry, men of literature, and they really were giants, many of them, and they came up through this system of education, not schooling, but education. Did they go to a school? Did they go to a school building? Well, after some years of home education, they did go to a building to meet knowledgeable men, the dawns of the great universities. But it was nothing like schooling, what happened. And this, learning about this, because we have, even up till today, in two of the most famous and effective schools over the centuries, Oxford and Cambridge, we have an example that's still alive after many centuries. And I have visited both universities. I know more about Cambridge, so I'd like you to listen to how different it is from anything an American school kid was forced to go through in America. And it was certainly different from anything that I was forced to go through. So at Cambridge, for the traditional undergrad, there are no class roll calls. Okay, I want you to listen carefully to this. There are no class roll calls in this school. There are no required numbers of credit hours that you have to collect. There's no typical grade point average. Lectures are optional. This is what life is like at Cambridge. So where did the system come from? Well, about 8 centuries ago. It really goes back to a long time ago. And some of the classrooms go back that far, and the steps going into the classrooms, you can see how they're worn down. Even some of the dormitories go back centuries. Well, Cambridge followed the Christian Hebraic model of teaching, and it's really not departed from it, even though it's a really expensive way to teach. It requires giving a very small number of students a vast amount of an academic's time. These professors who were generalists, who came there to really be able to impart their lives to these students, they given a lot of time to just a very few students. Okay, now, so it doesn't make for very good factory education like we have in the big land grant universities in America, where you might have 600 or 700 students in a freshman class who listens to one of these men lecture at the front of the room. That's what I went through. Cambridge does not do that. They do not pay exorbitant salaries to superstar professors like some U.S. colleges do. And yet, Cambridge continues to be one of the most influential universities in the world, turning out some men who really could said to be have good education, a rich education. And let's talk about this Christian Hebraic model that they still follow. Here's how simple it is. It involves intelligent face-to-face conversation with a student, between the student and the teacher. That's it. It's intelligent face-to-face conversation. And this is what a lot of you families have been discovering during the pandemic. Your children come home, they're with you, you're talking about things, you get on the internet, you look around at things, you spend time talking about what they've read or even new things that they're learning. And it's intelligent face-to-face conversation. This is one reason so many of the students really are loving being at home, because they're having some of this for the first time. It's not silly, foolish discussion with their peers in the bathroom. It is intelligent face-to-face conversation with their parents, or maybe with their bigger brothers and sisters. And so this works, whether it's for children sitting at their parents' feet. It works with college freshmen who think they're big stuff because they were accepted into Cambridge. And here's what it looks like at Cambridge. Let me tell you a little bit more. The incoming student gets a personal director of studies who will take a personal interest in the learning of that student. And then that director of studies will appoint a supervisor. And this is be the one who does all this intelligent face-to-face discussion with the student. And so the supervisor will assign an essay to the student. Okay, so there will be an essay, usually every week, a really important essay that the student has to go research and write. And it's an essay about a subject the student knows not a thing about. And so it's up to the student to steward his time, to really be responsible, to choose lectures that he can go to that are there on the school, to find resources, to dig into the library. Oh, wow, do they have rich, big libraries at Cambridge and Oxford. And so he can hunt down books, he can form conclusions, he can prepare for something that is going to be very difficult. And that's meeting with his supervisor for some of this face-to-face intelligent discussion. And at the appointed hour, he has to go in and sit down with the professor and let the professor read. Well, the professor has already read through his essay, and the professor is basically going to tear it apart. Okay? And this entire process of thought is going to be revealed to the student because the supervisor is going to just show him where he's ignorant. All right? And in so doing, every single week as he does this, the student becomes a lot less ignorant as he goes along. A much better student, a much better researcher, a much better communicator. So the supervision meeting, this happens. It's usually held between one supervisor and one student, or maybe there might be 2 or 3 in there, depending on the topic or the essay. It will last usually an hour. So there really is absolutely no place for an unprepared student to hide. You can't. Essentially, if you're not going to take advantage of what this is in Cambridge, I suppose they just throw you out. I don't know how that works, but I do know that there are students who are expelled. The meeting forces the students to verbally defend every single idea and concept in their papers. You know, why did you say this? And I talked to a student. He said, you know, it's pretty brutal. The supervisor will take your patient and just say, why did you say this, you stupid little boy? I mean, it's that blunt, and the student has to defend what he is saying, and sometimes he has no defense, and he has to say, I have no defense. And so this is what exposes the gaps in the student's knowledge and mind and thinking ability, and it identifies weaknesses in their ability to argue. Making an argumentation for an idea is part of what you need in your mental equipment to be able to enter life as an educated person. And then while the student is trying to recover from the experience of debating as a novice with a master in the field, he's given his next assignment. Go study this one and write a paper on this one. And so it's like this every single week. It's demanding. The next round of exploratory research, the writing of a new essay, a new argument for the tackling of a new set of questions, and preparation to meet with a supervisor that next week. And so the supervisor will carefully read the student's new paper and force him again to defend his every thought with a solid apologia and sound arguments. That's, you've got to defend what it is you've said. And it is these sound arguments that begin building a mind capable of sound learning. You'll know whether or not you have grasped something fully enough to be able to be said that you know it and you've got it. So this process that I've just described, I mean, you look at it, it's really not that complex. It goes back to this intelligent face-to-face discussion, student with teacher. And this can happen in your home. The supervisor reads the essay. He says, "Why in the world did you say that?" And after dozens of these supervisory encounters answering the demand to think about what you just said, young man, the student is forced to confront his own ignorance, his weak analytical skills, his inadequate arguing abilities, his lack of resourcefulness in studying, and he has to confront that. He also has to quickly improve on his communication, the intelligent defense of his ideas, grasp how little he truly understands about the world. But as he continues to be informed and sharpened by this far superior instructor, he learns, and he keeps learning, and he keeps learning. And as he learns to assimilate large amounts of this new learning in time for the deadline, the closer he gets to knowledge and wisdom and precise communication. And what is known, and this is what it's been known at Cambridge for all these centuries, sound learning. I mean, you can learn anything. You can learn stats on a football game or baseball statistics. But what is sound learning? To really be able to grasp wisdom on a subject of really great importance. So how does a student at Cambridge, you might wonder, actually finish and graduate? This again is really interesting. There may be a few fearsome end-of-year examinations to be tackled, but maybe not. It depends on the supervisor. The student needs no grade point average. He needs no credit hours. All he needs to graduate is one understated endorsement, which is given to the vice chancellor by the supervisor who knows the student. And the tutor's someone else who's kind of like a pastor or a counselor to the student. Students, when they used to go to Cambridge, they had learned so much homeschooling. They'd learned Latin and Hebrew and Chaldean and other languages at home before they even went, off to Cambridge. They learned many other things about theology and history. And so when they arrived, and sometimes they were only 12, 13, 14 years old, they usually had a tutor who supervised them spiritually just to make sure they're not going to get in serious trouble. He's more like a parent figure. So the supervisor and the tutor would give a recommendation to the vice chancellor, and they usually gave it in Latin. Everything used to be done in Latin at Cambridge. Now it's done in English. But the recommendation goes something like this. Here is a man that I know. I know him to be, because I've been around him, I know him to be of sound learning and good character, suitable to receive his degree. That's it. And if the supervisor can say that about you, you graduate and you get your degree. That's it. Let me say that again. Here is a young man that I know to be of sound learning and good character, suitable to receive his degree. That's it. And, now of course the supervisor is going to know everything about this young man and his ability to learn, how silly and ignorant and foolish he was when he came in, and how he improved and how he learned and how he learned to take bits of knowledge and put them together so that he was a wise student and not a foolish student. And so that the learning that he was getting was not on shaky ground, but it was on good solid ground. So then that's what helped him to become a man of sound learning. And this is what we really want for our children, isn't it? is exactly what we want to have with our children. And so how do we do this? Now this is what my wife and I were doing with our children. We didn't really know that it was a centuries-old model at Cambridge and Oxford. We've since learned that. But it's pretty simple. We began to pick up clues about it as we began as young Christians to look into Scripture and see how people would be taught in Scripture. But how hard is it? They read books, they discuss books. It's a face-to-face discussion. And then what we did as parents, we got them to research topics for papers and to discuss those face-to-face. And we got them to do other kinds of exercises with their siblings, and some of which were fun, some of which were really hard, like doing verbal essays in the living room together. And the point is, you don't have to be a Cambridge professor to sit down and talk with your student face to face. And in getting those intelligent conversations to happen, it will impart sound learning to your child. They will begin to realize they don't really understand the topic that they're working on that well. They need to study further. And you can say that, go back and research this a little bit more. You're just a student, come on, son or daughter, you're just parroting things that you're getting out of the encyclopedia. And the encyclopedia is politically correct. It's actually wrong. So what you've put here in your paper is false. It's not real knowledge. It's not wisdom. It's not even true. You need to go back and read real source documents and find out what's true. And so after a few times of doing this with papers, they realize, I can't trust the textbooks or the encyclopedia. They have been so terribly compromised. They're totally different from the source documents. Why have they been twisted so much? And then they begin to discover truth from source documents that's just really, really very rich. And so parents, I wish parents the world over would take a lesson from this. Here's a centuries-old method. It's based on the original idea of real learning. You impart good character. You stimulate sound learning. And this very simple approach has produced great leaders, free nations, civil society. But it does take time. It takes a pretty good investment of time. And that's why if you're doing life together every single day, you have a lot of time to be talking about these things in just general conversation. You're driving to the hardware store to get parts that you need to fix this thing that broke because you're trying to build something important. It's your little Ponderosa that you've got. And yes, that's very expensive because it's time, and time is really valuable. So set up a culture in your home of reading and discussion. That's the most important thing I can say. Set up a culture in your home of reading and discussion. Then you'll be approaching real education and not just schooling. That's the primary secret to making this work. So running through these again, don't do schooling, do educating. And we just talked about what that is. Number 2, don't focus more on academics than you do on personal character. Keep that straight. Yeah, you want your children to be smart, but not with just a whole bunch of facts in their head that are false and wrong because they came out of a bad textbook. What you want them to have personal character so that they will be people of sound learning. Number 3, do life together, do everything together, especially work. Number 4, read to them and read with them. Help them to learn to love conversations about the things that they're learning because they're having to exercise their mind to do these things. And number 5, again, do tell them the truth about God, not misleading things about Him, putting Him so far on the shelf away that He's never part of the discussion. And you will need to dig into the Bible to get the truth out of it, but it's not that difficult to do. It's very easy to understand. So please do send me more questions and specifics on parenting, on education. I'll try to get to as many as I can. Thanks.
Please share this content with your friends. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to get announcements on new content.